Hello, and thank you for joining our second session of the 2024 SQE conference. If you want our first session, welcome back. Thanks for returning, and you know who I am. If you weren't able to join the first session, I should introduce myself. I'm Julie Swan. I'm Director of Education and Training at the SRA. And don't worry, if you did miss the first session, it is available to watch at your leisure. Just a reminder that you can post questions using the link at the bottom of the screen. It would be nice if you do put a question in, if you tell us who you are, but that's entirely optional. We've got a number of slots that make up this whole session, so I think we'll probably take questions at the end, but if there's any that we can easily pick up as we go, we'll do so. If you weren't in the first session, then I should tell you that we will be publishing a suite of reports in April. We'll be publishing the annual report on the 2022-2023 academic year, the independent reviewers report, our own quality assurance report, and the report on a survey we did on qualifying work experience. So that's something to look out for in mid-April. We've already had a question in asking when the fees for the next academic year will be announced, and they will be announced at the same time as we publish that package of information. So a reminder that this stream will be available to watch on Catch Up, and so will the slides and the links to the web pages, the relevant web pages to which you will refer. And of course, feel free to share the link with colleagues. So let's crack on. In the first session, we heard a good deal about SQE1 and SQE2, and in particular, how it went in the last year and some things to look forward to in the coming year. And we heard from Zoe Robinson, Kaplan's Director of Qualifications. But Zoe doesn't manage SQE single-handedly at Kaplan, and so we'll be joined in this session by a number of key people from the Kaplan team who will be sharing with you what they have learned and what they are doing to support candidates to prepare for the SQE and to support training providers to fulfil their role. We set aside a good deal of time for this session. There's plenty to cover, so we'll end by 12:45. But I think it's time to crack on. And we're going to start with Yanis, who's Head of Stakeholder Engagement at Kaplan. Welcome, Yanis. And I think what we would like to start with is a summary from you about some of the changes that have taken place in relation to the administration and delivery of SQE1.
Thanks very much, Julie. Thanks for having me today. If I could start maybe by not answering your questions, just because I know we've had a couple of questions from the previous session that we didn't get to that take us back to more fundamental questions around the SQE. So maybe if I just give a quick reminder to help address those questions before moving on to look at the key changes to the delivery of SQE1. And I know that we will have people joining us maybe who are new to the SQE or at the start of their candidate journey through the SQE. So no harm in just going back to some of the basics as to the structure of SQE. So we have SQE1 and SQE2, two key components of the exam, and testing the application of fundamental legal knowledge and principles. In SQE1, we do that by a computer-based and multiple choice test exams, FLK1 and FLK2, Functioning Legal Knowledge 1 and Functioning Legal Knowledge 2. Within SQE2, we're testing that within the context of oral and written skills. The written assessments for SQE2 are also taken at exam centres and are computer-based, and the oral tests are conducted in the UK by Kaplan at a number of test centres. So that's just a quick summary of the structure of SQE2 before we move on to some of the changes. And I know there was also a question in the last session around the number of sittings. So on the website, the SQE website, we do have information on the sittings which are coming up for SQE2 and SQE1. And again, as a reminder, that the essential timetable is that we have 2 sittings for SQE1 in January and July. And we have 4 sittings of SQE2 every 3 months, effectively, during the course of the year. And this is the first year in which we've moved to the 4 sittings. what we see from that is if you're taking SQE2 and unfortunately you don't pass, because of the timing of when results are released, the earliest opportunity to sit is essentially 6 months later. So both for SQE1 and SQE2, there is a level of equivalence in that any resit takes place essentially 6 months later. That's the current structure. That's what we're taking through to 2024. I know Zoe talked earlier about some of the data around resitters and how perhaps they weren't performing as well as first sitters in terms of the pass rate. So I would just reiterate that and just kind of flag to candidates the importance of considering when they are ready to take the assessments before they go ahead and think about their resits and indeed their first sits. So that's the current structure, and as I say, the dates and the timings are on the website. For 2025, we are planning to publish the rest of the assessment dates for 2025. We do have our basic timetable principles on the website, but we hope to be publishing, in particular for April SQE2 2025, those dates and the rest of the dates for 2025 as soon as possible, and we'll alert stakeholders to that when we do. So sorry, so a slight divergence there, but that's some of the basic information on SQE. In terms of the changes, are going back to your question around the delivery of SQE1. Zoe did touch upon these in the earlier session. So one of the key changes is we've moved to a 2-week SQE1 assessment window where we test the first paper FLK1 in the first week and the second paper FLK2 in the second week. And that's enabled us to obviously assess more candidates as the numbers are increasing. There's greater flexibility for candidates in terms of being able to select the date that they prefer, subject to availability of the test centre and those dates. It also has given us in Pearson VUE, the test centre, provider more flexibility in resolving issues and trying to resolve them quite quickly, and the flexibility of having those dates does help with that. And it also has enabled us to offer the assessment at different starting times as well, which we heard from candidates was a positive thing if we were able to facilitate that. So where that has been possible, we have allowed for it. And as I say, what that means now is that we have a fixed 2-week assessment window for SQE1 in the calendar.
Thanks, Yanis, and thanks for starting with the basics about SQE. Really, we could never repeat it too often. I think every time we do one of these sessions, there's somebody new. So thanks for that. So you mentioned the changes to delivery on SQE1, which we saw for the first time in January. And as a consequence of that, we've moved to scaled scoring. Now, I know there was a webinar on the 28th of February, which is available to view. But again, I think it might be helpful if you could just summarise what scaled scoring is all about, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this is a relatively new thing, I think, for kind of older lawyers like myself, I'd say, who are used to a slightly different approach. But this allows us to have multiple, the move to the longer assessment window allows us to have multiple SQ1 assessment papers during the assessment window. And moving to a system of scaled scoring essentially allows a better comparison between assessment papers across windows and within an assessment window, as we place the papers on a common scale, which allows it, as I say, it makes it much easier to compare them across the assessment windows and within an assessment window. And referring back to that webinar that you mentioned, my colleague Lisa, if people do want to go back and look at that one, does go through a very comprehensive step-by-step approach as to how scaled scoring works and the mechanics behind that, which is, as I say, it's an interesting thing for people to view to see what sits behind it. As I say, it's a bit of a change for many people like myself who kind of grew up with the kind of previous regime of qualification. But I think for candidates, the key aspect to take from this is really being able to look at the information within their candidate account, looking at their results and being able to kind of interrogate the information that's there, in particular if they're considering a resit, if they find that they have not passed. And I think that's the key thing I would emphasise for candidates who are looking at this.
Yeah, absolutely, Yanis. And of course, the first candidates to receive scaled scores got those scores last week, those candidates who sat SQE1 in January. Those candidates will know how the information is presented to them, but many others won't have seen it, of course. So can you tell us a bit more, please, about what candidates see when they get their results from SQE1 now?
Yeah, absolutely. And we, again, this is a bit of a recap on the webinar, but there's no harm in going through it. So in terms of the display, we've got some slides here just taking us through the basics. So this first slide just shows the results page for FLK1, and candidates can then look at that. They can quickly see, did I pass this paper or not? So just a reminder that there are two papers, FLK1 and FLK2, and candidates will see the separate results for each paper. They can see the assessment date, and as I say, importantly, they will see whether they've passed or not. They will also see their raw score or their raw mark. So essentially the number of questions they scored correctly out of the number of questions on the paper. So in this case, 180. And they also see their scaled score. So the pass mark will now be presented as a scale score of 300, and anyone that scores above that scale score of 300 will pass that exam. So again, a slightly different way of presenting it, but importantly, candidates can still see the number of questions they scored correctly for that paper. And then similar information is presented for the next results page for FLK2. And again, it's a similar kind of information. Candidates can see whether they passed or not, the assessment date, and again, their raw score and also their scaled score. So in this case, unfortunately, a candidate did not pass. So this would be the one that they would be looking at maybe in more detail. They can also see the quintile in which they fall. So essentially, which area, how well did they perform compared to the assessment cohort as a whole. So if somebody's in the 5th quintile, that would be the bottom 20% of that cohort. And if somebody was scoring highly and they were in the 1st quintile, they would be in the top 5th of that cohort effectively. But I think the key point now is the ability for candidates to click on the detailed breakdown of marks, and that then takes us through for one of the larger changes, which is that candidates can now see their results broken down by practice area. And we did have a lot of feedback from candidates about this and how they would like to have that detailed information, in particular if they're unfortunately having to take a resit. So again, for this particular candidate, I'd be looking at the areas where if I was the candidate, where I'd scored lower than 300, the passing standard, and I'd be looking at that for each of the practice areas, and I'd be focusing on the FLK or the paper that I'd be resitting. And so you can see there it's broken down by practice areas, and the candidate can quickly assess, how well did I do in each of those practice areas, which are the practice areas that I need to maybe focus on for any resit, and that may also kind of help them plan their revision and indeed when they might be taking the resit, depending on their scores for each of those areas. So yeah, so it's an important change, and hopefully gives the candidates a bit more visibility as to areas where they could improve and indeed areas where they did perform quite well.
Thanks, Yanis. And there's a video available, isn't there, which a YouTube video available which demonstrates this too?
That's right, and I think we're going to play the video now. It's very short, and it's one that just shows candidates how they can access their results, and again just shows this display for them. And we showed this, and it's available on the SQE website. I think it's available on the SRA's website as well. And it's just a helpful visual tool for candidates when they're accessing their results as to what they can expect to see.
So let's have a look at that then. Thanks, Yanis.
Log into your SQE account by entering your username and password, then clicking the Login button. You'll then see the SQE overview page. Scroll down to the section labelled Get Your Results, click on Show Details, then view your results. You can also access your results by choosing the Results tab on the right-hand side of the page. On the Results page, you will see an overall mark as a scaled score figure out of 500. The pass mark will always be 300. For both FLK1 and FLK2, you will also see how many correct answers you got out of 180. Then, if you have passed or not passed. There will also be a detailed breakdown of your marks organised by practice area and mark. These marks are also out of 500 for each practice area. For those that are resitting SQE1, you can see your earlier results by clicking on the View Previous Results. Depending on when you took SQE1 previously, your results will show in one of two ways, either showing a similar breakdown of your results out of 500, or in the old format showing a percentage mark out of 100.
Great, thanks. So that remains available to view if you want to go back and check out the information that's available to candidates when they've get their SQE1 results. So January SQE1 candidates also had the benefit of a new booking process if they wanted to go straight on to do SQE2 in April, of course, subject to them passing SQE1 in January. Can you tell us a bit more about the changes to the process and how it went, Yanis, please?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, we changed the approach to bookings for April SQE2. So we were aiming, but based on candidate feedback and from training providers and other stakeholders, we were aiming to provide an easier way for candidates to book and less time consuming with less need to be part of a virtual queue. So we did this by using an online seat reservation form where we asked candidates if they were intending to sit April SQE2, and we would ask them for where they would like to sit, their preferences and the dates that they would like. So we're aiming to give more certainty to candidates that they would secure a seat. We're aiming to remove the need for virtual queuing when actually booking a seat, and we're trying to also keep some of the self-service elements, so whereby candidates can still reschedule if they would like to do that. They can do that online, but also just trying to make the whole process slightly smoother and avoid the levels of support that we've heard that have been required from training providers and employers. So far the feedback we've had has been positive. We will be seeking direct candidate feedback when we speak to them in our focus groups after the April assessments, and we're also speaking to training providers to get their further thoughts as well. So essentially we're planning to use that process going forwards for SQE1 in July and SQE2 in July, and we'll be publishing information on the website and also contacting candidates directly by email to start that process off. So there'll be more information available on the website in the coming weeks, and we hope that process will be smoother for candidates involved.
Thanks, Yanis. I really look forward to hearing candidate feedback, because the changes were made very largely in response to feedback from candidates who had booked onto earlier sittings who would have preferred a quicker, smoother journey. And so far those changes seem to have worked well. So thanks for that. And lastly, Yanis, for now, the other major change that's been introduced is that we're providing extra feedback to training providers. Now, this is feedback that's going to them on a confidential basis, and it will supplement the information that will be available on how candidates performed in different practice areas. That information will be available at cohort level in the annual report. But can you tell us more, please, about what's going to training providers and why?
Yeah, absolutely. So my colleague Lisa will pick up on some of the detail in the next session in any event, and I know Zoe mentioned it, but yes, after each SQE1 and annually for SQE2, we'll be providing performance data to training providers, as we mentioned, on a confidential basis and also anonymized, so no candidates will be identified. And we're doing this really just essentially to try to help to give the training providers some information on how candidates that indicated that they trained with them were performing at that kind of that cohort level. And broadly, it will show the performance of the candidates that indicated in the Maximising Diversity survey that they are affiliated with that training provider, compared against the performance of the entire cohort, as you mentioned. It's for internal use by the training providers. They can use that information as they see fit internally to see if it gives them any insights as to their course provision. But that data is not published. It's confidential. That goes directly to the training provider. And of course, no training provider is obliged to have it, but they are, of course, welcome, and we would encourage them to have it if they would like it. I think from my perspective, in terms of my role, I think it's a good opportunity to encourage candidates to complete the monitoring and maximising diversity surveys as accurately as they can when they come to complete that, as that's the source of information that we use to identify the candidates as having trained with a particular training provider. And obviously, the more candidates that complete that accurately, the better the quality of information is that we provide to the training providers. And then, of course, the better it is for the training providers, as they have accurate information to then use as they see fit. So yeah, I would definitely encourage all candidates to make sure they're completing that survey as accurately as possible, because that will help in the data that's provided.
Thanks, Yanis. Yeah, that's a good message to get out to candidates. That is an important survey for them to complete. It might be a good time now for me to distinguish between that information that's going to training providers on a confidential basis that will focus particularly on breakdown by practice area, and the commitment that we at the SRA have made to publish data on outcomes for both SQE1 and SQE2 that shows the how candidates who have told us through this survey that they have trained with particular training providers have performed. So we had hoped to publish that data by the end of last year, but we didn't have enough data to be able to publish it in a useful form in a way that would be helpful for candidates. So we have put a pause on that, but it's still very much our intention to publish such data as soon as we have sufficient available. So watch this space for that. I say it's a commitment that we've made and we will fulfill. It's just a matter of timing and data availability. So Yanis, thank you very much for that overview on some of the changes that have been made. We're now going to hand over to Lisa, who is Kaplan's Director of Psychometrics and Assessment Development. We might get a little bit more technical here. We usually do with Lisa, but Lisa will try to keep everything as accessible as possible, I know. So Lisa, I'm going to hand over to you. I think you've got some slides to take us through.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much. So I'm Lisa, and as you've heard, I'm Director of Psychometrics and Assessment Development for Kaplan. My team is the team that works with the data that contributes to quality assuring the test and ensuring essentially that our outcomes are valid and fit for purpose. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the changes that we've already heard, but from a psychometric point of view that we will have ahead in 2024 for SQE for candidates and training providers. Last year I looked at how performance had been generally across practice areas, so I'm going to give an update on that for last year as well. And finally, I'll just take a very quick look at the performance of our apprentice group. So as you've heard, the main change that we've seen is the introduction to scaled scores. Scaled scores provides much more comparability of tests for us, both between and within test windows. That includes our breakdowns of scores and also includes comparisons between FLK1 and FLK2. So it just makes everything a lot more robust. I just wanted to stress, and you've heard quite a lot about the scaled scores this morning, but I just wanted to stress that there are no other changes to our exam process. Everything is exactly the same as it has been before. So we'll be setting pass marks as we normally do. We go through our test validation as we normally do. We then scale each pass mark to equal 300 and place the candidate scores on the scale relative to that pass mark. So passes and fails are retained throughout the process. January's SQE1 was the first test that this has been done with. It seems to have worked quite well, and our post-test report will be available very, very soon. So moving on to our feedback for candidates. For FLK1, last year we looked at a little bit about how the different practice areas have performed in SQE1 and SQE2. So this year we can have a look at how things have progressed or not progressed, or what's similar, what's different. Starting with FLK1. So for FLK1, we previously saw some really good scores in ethics and contract law, and poorer scores for business law and practice and dispute resolution. And you can see on the slide there which tests are included from the previous window at the top and on our current window at the bottom. It's still almost the case this time. We saw scores for business law and practice really pick up for the January test. And instead of seeing scores for legal service questions drop a little bit. Tort was very mixed, and despite its poor performance in January, did much better in the July test. So some of those scores increase in some tests and decrease in another, and it's been fairly mixed. Moving on to FLK2, again, you can see the feedback we gave last year at the top and the feedback this year at the bottom here. So again, we see the same good and poor performing areas we did last year. We've seen a drop in scores for criminal law and practice questions as well this time round. I think it's worth noting that we've seen good but not outstanding law scores for both land and trust law questions as well over a number of tests, but they've been consistently scoring well this year as well. So again, a little bit of feedback on how the different practice areas have behaved. If we have a look at SQE2, again, SQE2 is a little bit more complex, and again, we'll start with a reminder of what we saw last year. In fact, when we did this last year, we only had one reportable SQE2 test, and we'd seen some consistently good scores in the majority of stations. Of note, there were the legal research, dispute resolution, advocacy and criminal litigation, and the case and matter analysis and business stations. Legal writings dispute resolution station was the lowest scoring of those. So we saw a relatively mixed sort of pattern of stations, but we only had the one test at the time, and they were a consistently high scoring assessment. So when we look at this year for SQE2, and if we can move on to the next slide, it's quite challenging this time to provide a really good, robust overall summary, partly because this time around we have 4 more test windows to look at. That means that we've had a number of sittings within each one, and so these are very, very general observations. I would say that the majority of our stations are still performing exceptionally well, and that we would probably expect, given that those who sit the assessment have moved past SQE1 or have demonstrated that they're able to be of the quality to sit SQE2. It's also equally true of the oral and written stations, so it isn't that one is performing well and the other is performing badly. So we see some really consistently good scores across the board. The performance across stations, again, has generally been very, very consistent. Highest scores tend to come from advocacy stations, which I think have been consistently good across every test window that we've had. But in some cases, stations vary across tests, and many of the legal writing and business stations have been at the lower end of the scoring, but it does drop in and out for each test a little bit. And I would advocate very much going and looking at the test reports for the individual tests, especially for candidates. If you've sat a test, there is lots of detailed information available to show you how your test performed and how the stations that you sat will have performed. So For our training providers, and again, as you've heard previously, there is going to be some more information for training providers. So I just wanted to add a quick update on our work and share some information with the training providers from a psychometric team point of view. We'll be doing this for the first time following our most recent SQE1 delivery. Each provider will receive information on the proportion of their candidates who have both declared their information and appear in each quintile of the assessment and with the practice areas that are within it. So what we're looking at is whether the training providers candidates are mainly in the higher end of the scoring range or in the lower end, and that is the information that we'll be providing. So I just wanted to stress this is a really high level summary, and the information is very much aimed to give our training providers the same information really that we've just been looking at on the previous slides about which areas perform well and which areas perform poorly. No identifiable data is being shared. So I would echo what Yanis has just said about providing information. Any summary information that is shared is provided in confidence, and the training providers don't get to see individual data. So we are providing that very high level summary. I can't give a definitive date for it just yet, but I would say that we are currently on track to provide it, and it should be available shortly after the post-test reports for SQE1 are published. So again, there will be some information for the training providers, plus then a comparison of how each test has performed, each FLK has performed for SQE1. Finally, I just sort of wanted to talk very briefly about our apprentice profiles. I just wanted to share a bit of this because the apprentices who take SQE do exceptionally well and have done exceptionally well last year. So our SQE1 pass rate for apprentices was 71.7 overall for FLK1 and 70.5 for FLK2. So more than 2/3 of our apprentices pass the SQE1. For SQE2, as you can see, it's 98.7%. So it's a virtually 100%, almost every candidate in SQE2 that is an apprentice passes. I am aware that we may see some changes to these figures as we start to see more graduate apprentices over 6-year apprentices, but I think it demonstrates quite nicely that there's an alignment of the work carried out by the apprentices and the things that they learn with the context of the SQE and the practicing solicitor. And I think it clearly shows the value of being an apprentice. It also, for me, from a psychometric point of view, helps to validate the role in SQE1 of ensuring that candidates have the knowledge that they require to move to SQE2, as is demonstrated by that really, really high pass rate. So that's a brief tour of our performance data from me. If you'd like further information on the scaled scores, there is an SRA webinar that's available on YouTube where I can take you step by step through the process of how our scores are scaled. And for more information on the test performance and on each of these areas for each delivery of SQE1 and 2, there are post-test reports published online after every assessment window. So that will very much, the one for scaled scores will appear very soon. So thank you very much, and I'll hand back to you, Julie.
Thanks, Lisa. And we did have a couple of questions in from training providers, which Lisa had anticipated. Training providers are keen to see the broken down information by practice areas for the candidates who are associated with them, understandably. Lisa, you said that you can't give a definitive date yet. Clearly, priority has been given to getting the SQE1 results out and then that post-test report. But that will be published, I think, mid-April. So it'll be sometime after that, before that data is available to training providers.
Yes, and once those reports have been published, at the moment we don't foresee any delays in doing the training provider data. So I think it will be very quickly after the main reports have been published that will be available.
Thanks, and we'll reach out to training providers. Don't worry, you won't miss out. We'll reach out and let you know. We're keen that you have this because we think it's very much will help you serve the interests of your candidates by understanding better how your candidates are performing in different practice areas. So thank you so much for that, Lisa, and a reminder that Lisa's slides will be available to view at your leisure. So we're now going to move on to Tim. We've got two Kaplan Tims, so we're going to move on to Tim Madison. Tim is SQE1 Academic Director, and so unsurprisingly is going to focus now his presentation on SQE1, in particular providing an update on what's been done with regard to guidance and sample questions on SQE1. So Tim M, can I hand over to you, please?
You can indeed. Thanks, Julie. Good morning, just about everyone. My name is Tim Madison. I'm the SQE1 Academic Director at Kaplan. I'm going to be spending the next 15 minutes or so talking through two key elements of SQE1 that have certainly been the focus of some of the candidate feedback that we've received. The first of those is the SQE1 sample question. So I'll be running through a recap of some key points on the sample questions and also looking at what we've done in response to candidate feedback. And secondly, I'm going to be talking a little bit about candidate timing in the assessments as well. So really just sharing some details of the ongoing analysis that we do, monitoring candidate timing. And I'll also be talking through a little bit of analysis that we've done on our assessment word count and reading speeds as well. I'm conscious as well that we've had some questions in relation to our sample questions already, and they may well be answered as I go through. So we may not answer those questions directly given the content of what I'm going to cover. So if I move on, then I'm going to first of all just take you through some key points in relation to our SQE1 sample questions before we talk about the feedback that we received from candidates. So firstly, we've got 130 SQE1 sample questions on the website. We have 65 for FLK1 and 65 for FLK2. And what they do is they show the kind of questions that appear on the FLK1 and FLK2 assessments, and they're designed to help education providers and candidates with their SQE1 training and preparation. Importantly, though, the sample questions don't do a number of things. So the sample questions don't cover the entirety of the FLK, and indeed that's the same could be said for any SQE1 assessment. But importantly, they don't replicate sitting the SQE1 assessments as well. So as I'm sure many of the people watching this will be aware, the SQE1 assessment comprises 360 questions that sat over 2 days in 2 different papers. And the SQE1 assessments are sat under timed conditions and in closed book conditions, and on the Pearson, for the vast majority of candidates, on the Pearson VUE system as well. So they're displayed on the Pearson VUE screen in their testing environment. And that's obviously a very, very different experience taking the assessment than it is going through the sample questions that we have on the website. What I would say in terms of that final bullet point, though, is some strong advice to candidates. We do have a Pearson VUE demonstration site on the website. You can find it on the SQE1 sample questions website. So I'd really highly recommend that candidates do have a look at that, have a play around, and it really gives you a feel for what the questions will look like on the Pearson VUE system before you actually go into the assessment itself. So moving on then to the feedback that we've received. So I said that what I'm going to focus on really centres around the feedback that we've received from candidates, and it's quite right for that to do so. What we've seen over the course of the SQE1 assessments is that we get candidate feedback expressing a view that the sample questions on the website are perhaps easier and shorter than what the candidates have seen in the assessment. And secondly, that the candidates would like some more sample questions. So before I talk about the actions on the second half of that slide, I'll just respond to those particular pieces of feedback. In terms of that first bullet point, so essentially looking at the sample questions might not be quite as representative of the assessment as some candidates would think. all of the sample questions come from our SQE1 question bank, and our SQE1 question bank is obviously where we take the questions for our assessment. So they're all written and set at that same level required of a competent newly qualified solicitor in practice. And those sample questions are obviously reviewed and go through our really thorough and rigorous question writing and approval process, but they are actually reviewed by two other groups of people who perhaps have a more objective view and stance when they're reviewing questions. So the first group is our ANGOF panel. So our ANGOF panel is a panel of between 10 and 15 qualified solicitors. They come from a really diverse range of practice areas, backgrounds and experience, and their primary job is to help us set the pass mark for SQE1. So they review all of the questions that go in an assessment and rank those questions with a score per their difficulty. The ANGOF panel sits every 6 months, and every 6 months we are very keen to put forward a selection of our sample questions to the ANGOF panel just to see how they score those for difficulty and compare that to how they score the questions that have gone into the assessment. And the scoring is very much in line between those two sets of questions. The other group of people that have reviewed hundreds of questions that have got into the SQE1 assessment, but also our sample questions, are the SRA's subject matter expert solicitors, and they've undertaken a review of the sample questions, and from their perspective they see that there's no discernible difference between the sample questions that they've reviewed and the questions that they have reviewed that have gone into the assessment. But it's important for us to help candidates. Of course, we are getting that feedback, and so clearly candidates do feel that perhaps the questions aren't quite as representative as what they see in the assessment. So what have we done in response or to help candidates? Well, we can see on the bullet points there at the bottom of that slide that we've taken a number of different actions over the course of the last couple of years to try and assist candidates. The first thing we've done is we've amended the guidance on the website. We've done that a couple of times now, really to reflect the points that I've gone through already. Really to try and help candidates understand the purpose of the sample questions and the differences between reviewing those and the actual assessment experience itself. We've amended the order of the sample questions. This is based on analysis of the number of views that each question gets, and we see the number of views of the sample questions reduces as we go through the sample questions. So we've reordered them a little bit to maybe sort of front load a bit of a mixture of longer and shorter questions in case candidates aren't looking at all of the sample questions. We've looked at candidate timing statistics as well, and I will cover that in a bit more detail in the second part of my session. But the reason we've looked at that is that if candidate feedback is that the sample questions are perhaps a little bit easier and shorter and then perhaps quicker to get through, we wanted to make sure that candidates do have enough time in the assessment, and I'll cover that a bit later on. All of our questions do follow the same structure, and if anyone would like to have a look at that structure of an SQE1 question, we've uploaded a video, which you see there, the anatomy of an SQE1 question, which candidates can of course have a look at. And importantly, and this goes to the first and second bullet points there on the feedback, is that we added 40 new SQE1 sample questions to the website late last year in November. We added 20 for FLK1 and 20 for FLK2. And those questions, again, have all come from the question bank. They're in fact all questions that have been used in an SQE1 assessment previously as well. And we were very conscious and deliberate when we were selecting those questions to make sure that we did have a variety of different question length, which again is what candidates will see in the assessment, and also a variety of difficulty, and we've looked at that not only on the ANGOF scores that candidates have, that the ANGOF panel has applied to those questions, but we're also able to see how candidates have performed on those questions as well. So those additional 40 certainly add to the number of questions that we've got, but they also do very much reflect what candidates are likely to see in the assessment. And moving on to the second part of my session then, some more feedback that we've received from candidates, although probably less so, is that some of the candidates are finding that there's element of time pressure in the assessment. I should note that we do receive feedback as well from some candidates saying that actually they find that there is enough time in the assessment to get through it and complete it. But we have heard in some of our focus groups especially that time pressure is an issue for some candidates. So what we've continued to do is to review the candidate's timing data. We actually presented on this time last year at the conference in relation to the first 2 SQE1 assessments. We're obviously able to sort of develop that now we've had more sits. So I'm going to take you through some of that timing data, but overall what the data is showing us and what it continues to show us is that candidates are really managing their time extremely well in the assessments. I've just picked out a couple of elements of the candidate timing data to talk you through, which I think would be useful. The first is the table there. You can see the first 4 SQE1 assessments here. And what this is showing us is the percentage of questions that are taking less than 20 seconds to answer. And you can see that's a really, really very low percentage of questions. And what that shows us is that candidates, generally speaking, are not guessing at questions. They're not spending really small amounts of time on the question and just having a punt at it with not really having the chance to read the question. And we're also seeing that the proportion of candidates that are not answering all of the items or questions in an assessment is again really low, which again would suggest that candidates are managing their time to get through the questions and answer them, having read through the questions as well. If we move on to just the final bit of data that I wanted to show you. Don't worry too much about those really colourful charts at the moment. I will very briefly talk you through the relevance of those, but it does indicate some further analysis that we've been doing. But really what it does show and supports is the fact that there are very few candidates spending a low amount of time on any particular question in the assessment. And when candidates are spending a lower amount of time in the assessment, it is very much towards the end of each session in the assessment. And we can see that when we look at these charts. You of course can't see the detail of the charts, but they do paint a useful picture. Each of those different bands of colour represents a different amount of time that a candidate is spending on a question. And as you go towards the bottom of those bands, that's the lower amount of time. So if I just take that top chart, for example, you can see there were 2 blocks of data there. That represents the 2 sessions in an SQE1 assessment. So the first 90 questions and then the second 90 questions. There's a break in between. And what we can see there, if we take the yellow banding at the bottom there, the yellow band represents candidates taking less than 30 seconds on a question. So that's a really, quite a low amount of time. And it's really quite telling that you can't really see much of that yellow band because there are very few candidates spending less than 30 seconds on a question. You can see there towards the end of each session, that yellow band gets a little bit bigger. So there are a few more questions where candidates are taking less than 30 seconds. But generally speaking, we can see that candidates are taking a really good amount of time on the questions and managing their time really well throughout the course of that assessment. And then finally, I wanted to talk through, we've looked at the data. I wanted to just talk through some analysis that, again, we continue to do on our word counts in our assessment and how that marries up with reading speeds to give us the confidence that candidates have enough time to get through, read and comprehend the questions that we put forward in SQE1. So we obviously monitor our word counts. And keep those under review to make sure that we have a real level of equivalence between our papers. But we also have done plenty of research analysis on reading speeds and text complexity, so we can put those together. It won't be a surprise for anyone to hear that the rate at which a candidate can read a question depends on how complex the text is that they're reading. And so we've been able to have a look at our questions and check how complex the language is that we are using. And that can be measured by using the average word length of a question. And what that analysis has shown is that the average word length of our questions is really very slightly higher than the average that you would see for average of non-fiction text, but it is very slightly higher. And what that allows us to do is then to put that onto the average reading speed for a candidate and give us an accurate reading speed as to which candidates can get through our questions. We've also run our questions through an AI tool to check their complexity as well. And what that tells us is that our questions really fall in the middle ground. The AI tool rates it from low, medium to high, and the vast majority of our questions are falling in that medium range as well, which backs up our analysis on the average word length. So if we put all that together, what we're able to see is that we're able to have an accurate reading speed for the text complexity of our questions, and that shows that then candidates really do have enough time to go through, read the questions, comprehend them, including the options, and come to a conclusion as to which option that they would like to go for. We've also, of course, looked at the impact of age, for example, and English as a second language as well, because those are factors that can reduce the rate at which someone can read a question. We've also taken into account the requirements of the SRA in terms of the level of language competency that someone would need for the English language, and putting those together again, we're able to conclude that even if someone has English as a second language taking the assessment, they do have sufficient amount of time to be able to read and comprehend those questions before they answer those questions as well. So that's it from me. I hope that was useful, and thank you very much for listening, and I will hand back to Julie.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks so much. I'm sure everybody watching today will have found that really useful and interesting, and also reassuring, both that you've been listening to feedback from candidates and undertaking some really quite extensive analysis to understand if there is anything that needs to be addressed there. I hope that those listening today will be reassured about the nature of the analysis and the conclusions of the analysis, and about the safeguards and checks that are in place to make sure that the assessments are manageable and fair. So thank you for that, and I'm sure everybody has very much welcomed the additional sample questions that were published at the end of last year. My hunch is that looking at sample questions, as you say, in your own home is probably quite different to the experience that you have in an examination centre under test conditions, and probably the message is to try some of the questions under, as far as it's possible, to replicate them exam conditions. So thank you. Okay, we're going to move on now then to SQE2, as you might expect, and we've got Kate Cooper as Academic Director for SQE2, again, unsurprisingly. And Kate, let's start again with sample questions, but this time for SQE2, because some changes have been made to the published sample questions for SQE2 as well. Can you tell us about what's changed and why?
Thank you very much, Julie. Very nice to be here this afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, of course. So in answer to your question, in December 2023, so end of last year, we published a revised and updated set of SQE2 samples on the SRA SQE website, and provided more detailed guidance really on the types of tasks that could be set for candidates. So we revised the SQE2 samples because we'd received candidate feedback that had expressed a concern about a lack of transparency and lack of information on the website about the SQE2 assessment questions. And we really, as much as anything, wanted to address those concerns. So that was one of the main drivers. So we hope that the sample answers and questions that are there now will really help our candidates, and of course training providers as well, to sort of understand a number of things. So first of all, we hope that they'll have a better understanding about the content and the format of the SQE2 assessments. Second, that they'll have an idea of the level and the breadth of the assessments and the types of tasks that candidates could be set in the assessments. And also just to give it really a feel for the style of assessment to expect on the day. it's also a way, I think, to sort of see questions that are more representative of the SQE2 assessments themselves. And I think another really important point to make at this stage is just to say that it's also a really good indication for candidates who may be preparing for the SQE2 assessments of the considerable level of work that's involved in that preparation. So there are a number of sort of things that we hope it will be helpful for.
Thanks, Kate. So how many samples are on the website now, and can you tell us how the samples work?
Yes, absolutely. So on the slide that's just appeared on screen, you can see a sort of a breakdown of the samples, and we've got a number. So we've got 6 samples there in total. 2 of those are orals, and that's the first 2 on the slide. So we've got client interviewing, attendance note and legal analysis, and that's set in a probate context. And then we've got advocacy, criminal litigation. And the ones underneath are the written samples. So we've got a case and matter analysis in a business context, legal research in criminal litigation context, legal writing in property practice, and then legal drafting in dispute resolution. So it's really just sort of important to emphasise to everybody who's listening that none of the samples that we've provided are intended to be a sort of a model answer. That they're not going to be perfect. They are examples of performances where candidates have clearly passed the competency requirements for that particular station. And our samples questions follow the same format. So with the exception of advocacy, which is a little bit different, and I'm going to come on to that a little bit later on in a later section of my talk and just explain that in more detail. When the candidates and training providers look at the samples, this is what you can expect to find under this format. So first of all, on the website, you'll see that there's a copy of a candidate email and relevant attachments, whatever those attachments may be. It will obviously depend on what the type of assessment is, but it might be things like witness statements, or it could be a particular claim if it's a drafting assessment, something like that. And the idea of those materials is that they give a little bit of detail about the scenario and provide candidates with a set of specific instructions on the task that they have been set. It's worth saying here that all of these scenarios are scenarios which are commonly encountered in practice. Our sample answer then also includes a discussion document, and this document's got lots of useful information in it. It sets out some key legal points which show the sorts of legal issues that a newly qualified solicitor might be expected to cover in their answer, and also a short analysis of the responses. And it's worth, I've already made this point, but I think it's just worth reminding ourselves here that these samples are examples of candidates who have clearly passed the assessment station. So the analysis of the sample responses really sets out why the candidates are clearly above the competency requirements. So in other words, what we're trying to do with these sample answers is to give our candidates a bit of guidance by reference to the assessment criteria on the sorts of things that they might do in order to be clearly passing in each category of skills and law.
Thanks, Kate. You've mentioned a couple of times that the focus is on the clearly passing candidate. Why do you put the focus there as opposed to elsewhere in the performance range?
Thanks, Julie. So it's a really good question. We felt when we reflected on it that it would just be really helpful for candidates to see some examples of what an answer looks like from a candidate who is above that threshold. So they clearly pass the threshold standard for the assessment, and that would be perhaps more helpful than having an illustration of a minimally competent candidate. So that's why we've set it at that level. Again, worth reflecting here that our sample answers are not model answers, that they're not perfect, as I've said before, and they don't provide a comprehensive narrative of what a candidate needs to do in order to be clearly passing. And of course, there are many different ways that our candidates could approach the answer to the assessment. But I think that sort of desire to set it at the clearly passing level to give an indication of that standard, we thought would be helpful.
Thanks, Kate. And it makes sense. So the focus of this session is about helping candidates prepare, helping candidates make an assessment for themselves as to when they're ready, And I guess most candidates aspire to perform at the level of the clearly passing candidate, not just to hop over the hurdle, if you like. So
absolutely, yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, so can we move on then to performance indicators, please? This is
Yes.
something new. What are they, and why have you published them?
Thanks, Julie. You're absolutely right. They are new. We published them on the website in 2023, December 2023, with the revised SQE2 samples that we've just been talking about. And they're up there on the slide for you now. And there's a set of performance indicators for each of our assessments. So very sort of simple list there. But as a reminder, client interviewing, attendance note and legal analysis, advocacy, case and matter analysis, legal research, legal writing, and legal drafting. And we think that these performance indicators will be helpful both to candidates and training providers because we don't have a prescriptive mark scheme for SQE2. So what they do is they illustrate how the threshold standard can be applied to the assessment criteria. And the performance indicators for each of our assessment stations give some examples of the types of behaviour that demonstrate competence or suggest that a candidate is not competent in relation to each of those law and skills assessment criteria. They're set out in a very simple table format. It's very intuitive. So we hope that candidates will find them nice and easy to navigate and also to apply. And as well as being available for our candidates to see and for training providers to have a look at, the performance indicators are also used by our markers of the written assessments and the oral assessors to help them to evaluate candidates' performance. So they're also a useful tool there. Just to emphasise here, our performance indicators they're not a checklist. So when the assessors and markers do their marking, they don't go through each of the criteria on the performance indicators and one by one and tick them off the list. The performance indicators are really just there merely as to give examples of the sorts of things that could indicate competence or non-competence in a particular category.
Thanks, Kate. So can you tell us a bit more about how the performance indicators are actually used? I think they will be interested in that, please.
Sure, thanks, Julie. So if we take the advocacy performance indicators just as an example, and we know for advocacy that there are 5 skills categories and 2 law categories in an oral advocacy assessment. And just to refresh everybody's mind on that, so our skills categories, we've got use of appropriate language and behaviour, adopting a clear and logical structure, presentation of a persuasive argument, interaction with or engaging with the court appropriately, including all key relevant facts. So those are our 5 skills categories. And in the law, we've got applying the law correctly to the client's situation. So legally correct and legally comprehensive. So applying the law comprehensively to the client's situation. And that includes any ethical or professional conduct issues. So those are our categories. And if we just take, let's just take our first category in the skills. So we've got use of appropriate language and behaviour. And if you have a look at the indicators when you go on the website, so the indicators demonstrating competence in that category. And remember, we're in an oral advocacy assessment. Let's imagine it's a criminal assessment. And this gives you an indication of the sorts of things that we might be looking for as indicators demonstrating competence. So it could be to do with the sort of formalities, the use of appropriate formalities that would be appropriate in a courtroom setting. So it might be, you know, that the manner of the candidate is polite or non-patronising. We might also be looking for things like use of language, so language which is appropriate for our courtroom setting, including use of expressions such as in my submission, it is the prosecution's case, or it is the defendant's case. Those are some of the indicators which could demonstrate competence. Conversely, on the other side of things, if we're looking at indicators that might suggest that a candidate is not competent, then it could be that the language is a bit too colloquial, colloquial or too informal. It could be to do with the sort of the formalities not being quite appropriate for the courtroom setting. It might be that the candidate is perhaps a bit verbose or confused in the submissions that they have delivered. So again, that just gives you an indication. And we can just have a quick look at the second one as well, very briefly. So our second skills category is adopting a clear and logical structure. Sort of similar idea there. It might be that to demonstrate competence, the candidate is able to summarise and draw conclusions as appropriate in their submissions to reinforce any desired outcomes that they want to reach in their advocacy application. That our candidate organises facts in a logical order to support their arguments that they're making or their position. Conversely, on the side of things where they're not demonstrating competence, that might be to do with failure to use any appropriate signposts to guide the judge through their submissions. So that's really just a flavour of the sorts of things that the performance indicators tell us and how you might apply them.
Thanks so much, Kate, and can only be helpful for a candidate and a training provider preparing or supporting somebody to prepare for the assessment and considering their readiness to be assessed. Thank you for that. That was really clear. And you helpfully picked on the advocacy example to illustrate the use of performance indicators, because the next major change was the introduction of a video to replace the written version of the criminal litigation advocacy sample question. Can you tell us more? I'd be really interested to know whether you've had any feedback as to how that video has been viewed and whether it seemed to be helpful.
Yeah, we have had good feedback on it, and it is a change. It's a departure from what was there previously, because of course previously we had a transcript for criminal litigation on the website. So we've moved, and we've made that decision to go in a different direction. Again, this is really sort of a response to candidate feedback and thinking about authenticity and how we can make it feel much more real for candidates. So it was that decision really that was the driver. So we wanted to create a more realistic setting for a real life advocacy assessment at an assessment venue. So that's what we've done. We've come up with a video. It is there on the website. It's getting lots of likes, and hopefully that's that's a good sign. And what the video does, just to give you a bit more kind of granular detail around it, is it shows a typical assessment room. It actually was filmed in an assessment room. And what we can see when you watch the video is we've got the candidates standing in order to make their submissions. And the reason they're standing up is because it's a criminal litigation advocacy assessment. The assessor's also present in the room, so they are there in their capacity as an assessor, of course, but they're also sort of in the role of the judge. So you can sort of get a brief panned shot across the room, and you can see that the assessor or judge is there. And in relation to the content of the submissions themselves, of course, it also just provides a flavour of how a clearly passing candidate might present their submissions. The same rules apply for this one as for all of the other samples, questions and answers on the website. It's not a model answer, it isn't perfect, but it does show you that sort of that standard that we're trying to show across the board, clearly passing, so they're over that threshold standard. And it just gives you sort of, I think, a feel for sort of what sorts of submissions the candidate might make, how they might make them, and of course it allows you to see some of the subtleties, I guess, as well of the interaction, the sort of live interaction between the candidate and the assessor. Now, I'm really conscious that we've had questions already from delegates who may be out there listening now and sort of in advance of the conference today about whether it would be sort of possible to receive more example questions, previous past papers, those sorts of things. And I hope that what I've talked about today goes some way to address those sort of concerns and to answer those questions, but sort of looking to the future, because I think it's important to know that we're keeping everything under review, we're keeping an eye on what we think candidates need and trying to be very cognizant of candidate feedback and to react to that. So we do have some plans afoot with our video recordings to do at least a couple more video recordings actually, so I can tell you that without giving an exact timescale, but fairly soon you're going to see on the website certainly a property or and a probate client interviewing assessment, and it may well be that there's a further advocacy assessment to come. So it's a case of watch this space, and details will be confirmed a little bit later down the track.
Thanks so much, Kate. I do love the advocacy video, I have to say, and I've observed some advocacy assessments remotely, actual advocacy assessments with real candidates, real assessments in a real assessment room. And I think the video does give you a real sense of what it's like when you first open the door and walk in the room. And as Tim was saying earlier, it's really helpful if candidates are familiar with the type of test environment that they're going to experience on the day. So thank you for that. Okay. Thank you, Kate. A reminder again that those slides are available. Of course, the sample questions and the performance indicators and the video that Kate has spoken about are available on the website to view at your leisure. So we're now going to move on to the final slot of this session, and we're going to invite the other Tim from Kaplan, Tim Allen, who is Head of Candidate Services at Kaplan, to share with us the common queries that he receives. If you were with us for the first session, Zoe encouraged people, and I'm sure Tim was pleased to hear this, to reach out to Tim's team, to Candidate Services, whether that's an issue with the allocation of a seat, the availability of a test centre in different parts of the other world. Tim is always pleased to hear from you, but if he can head off any questions by sharing the answers to some common queries, I'm sure he'll be pleased to do that too. So Tim, over to you, please.
Thanks, Julie. Good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to try and answer some very, very common questions that come into Candidate Services. Some of them may seem obvious, I don't know, but they are topics that create many emails and telephone calls into Candidate Services. So clearly they create a level of anxiety with our candidates, and clearly that's not a level that it's a level we'd like to avoid if we can. So let me start talking about common questions that we receive. So one of the common questions is, my results do not pull through from the SQE account into the My SRA account. Now, to take a step back from that, we have a similar issue around exemptions, and often we're talking to candidates who haven't even set up a My SRA account early on in their journey. So I would always recommend setting up both the My SRA account and the SQE account early on. If you set up the SQE account early on, we then have visibility of you and your likelihood of taking the next SQE1 exam, for example. So it gives us a good heads up that you are now interested in taking the exams. The most common issue about results pulling through or the exemptions not working is the fact that your personal details may be different on each of the accounts. So when you're setting up the two accounts, you need to be familiar of which account is which, obviously, because there is a level of confusion between the two accounts. But the personal details do need to be the same. Otherwise, the two accounts will not talk to each other from a security perspective. So you need to make sure the details are the same on those two accounts. It's the most common reason why results don't get pulled through. Another question we have is it okay if I've got two accounts? Now, if you think that one through, your account is your record of taking the assessments, fails, passes, all of the detail is on your account. So clearly what we can't have is one attempt on one account, another attempt on another account. We have to have one version of the truth and one account to do that. So if there are two or more accounts set up, it ultimately creates a block. It will create an automatic block, and you won't then be able to progress to take your next assessment. So if there are two accounts set up, we have to then take measures to remove one of those accounts or more accounts, depending on how many you set up. So it is an issue if you create more than one account. So please talk to us if you've got an issue with your existing account, because sometimes they're created out of frustration because maybe you can't get into the account or something. So talk to us rather than creating multiple accounts. We get asked if it's possible to defer assessments. It's not possible to defer an assessment. The cancellation rules are very clear in the terms and conditions on our website. So if you want to defer, the route to do that is to cancel your assessment in accordance to the terms and conditions, and then you have to book in the next booking window. And all of the timings are clear on the website if you need to understand when the next assessments are coming up and when you can book. Everything is on the website. It's the source of one truth. All of the information is on the website. QLTS candidates. We're asked about QLTS candidates. The transitional arrangements that were in place for QLTS candidates have now expired, but clearly we still have candidates who may have submitted mitigating circumstance claims, and they may be still talking to us about those. So there are still candidates who ultimately may seek exemptions through the SRA to seek extensions on those arrangements. However, the transitional arrangements have now expired. And the process to go forward for those who have not qualified to date, they would have to start again. We would literally block their old account with their QLTS transitional arrangements on, and the QLTS candidates or previous QLTS candidates would be creating a new SQE account. And therefore they would then take the SQE1 and SQE2, and they're very much part of the SQE process, the standard process that all candidates have to go through. Now, the major question type that we receive, it's quite frustrating because it's frustrating for you as candidates, and it's often very, very frustrating just before an assessment. And I quite see where where the anxiety lies, because I'm often there at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, answering questions the day before an assessment from candidates who don't understand which IDs to bring to their assessment. And clearly we want to remove as much of that anxiety as possible, because you've got so many other things to focus on. So it seems very sad that there's a focus on something such as ID. Now, when we all go abroad, we get very familiar with realizing how precious our passport or our tickets are. And it becomes, an automatic choice to look after those and realise what documents we need when we're going abroad. And the very same thing should be thought of for the assessments. Now, there has to be a high level of security. We have to check who's taking the assessments. That should almost go unsaid, because we have to check the identities of who is taking the assessments. Now, there are slight nuances with the oral assessments as to what is and isn't checked. So I'll almost give you my kind of Tim's one-size-fits-all solution to this, because it kind of simplifies life, if you like. Firstly, you're registering your main ID with your account when you're setting up your SQE account. So keep a note of which ID you've used there, and most people will use their passport as their main ID. So keep a note of that, because it often gets to the SQE2 oral and we have panic to say, hold on, I can't remember what ID I used, and is it my driving license, is it my passport? And that creates a level of angst. So just remember what document you've used. For simplicity's sake, most people use their passport. Now, of course, with most of our important documents in life, we need to keep those up to date. And as I said, it's a shame that the day before an assessment, candidates are panicking because they've realised they've changed their name, or their documents away because they've changed their address, and there is this panic. So remember what ID you have used to set up your SQE account. Contact candidate services well in advance if you cannot remember what ID you've used, and keep that ID up to date. Contact candidate services if you now have a new passport, and we'll replace that record. So if you keep that main ID up to date, and the website has examples of other documents you can use, if you keep your main ID up to date and you bring that along to every assessment, you're halfway there, because otherwise all you need is your second form of ID, and most use a credit or debit card, and that has to have been signed. Now, clearly, the most important point here is the names need to match. Now, that seems a very obvious thing, but we have had candidates appear with bookings in one name and main IDs in another name. Now, of course, there's some variation expected, maybe a full middle name versus an initial middle name, which clearly can be allowed because there is a level of discretion there. However, there has to be a match of names in total. We can't have totally different names on a booking compared to a totally different name on a passport or on the credit card. So I think that probably stands to reason, but it's remarkable how many instances of this we have. So yeah, they're my tips. Keep those two main IDs with you. You use your passport, remember what you're using, keep it up to date with us, and use say a credit or debit card, a signed one that has the same name, so that you don't come into these problems. And keep them close to you. It's part of your planning, and it will remove a lot of anxiety for people that often is created just before an assessment, which can't be good. Okay, Julie?
Thanks, Tim. Really helpful, really practical advice. I have to say, the thought of a candidate turning up with the wrong ID just makes me shudder. Please don't do it. Please follow the advice. Please don't wait till the night before to check what you need to do. Please be prepared. The theme of the conference, be prepared. The focus has been on be prepared to perform to the standard required to pass the SQE, but also be prepared with the inevitable and necessary and essential formalities to demonstrate your identity, so that we know that the correct person is taking the exam and the correct result is being allocated to the correct candidate. Thank you so much, Tim. We've got a few minutes left where we can pick up some questions that have come in. If we go back to where we started with scaled scores, some questions have been coming through about whether the main scaled score should be an average of the breakdown of scores. I'm hoping that Lisa is able to help with an answer to that one.
Yes.
Lisa?
Yes, absolutely. We have had a few queries about whether the main scaled score that you can see in your results, if you've got the latest set of results, is an average of the breakdown of marks, but it isn't, and I can explain why. It's because the proportions of questions within the assessment follow the proportions that are shown in the assessment specification, and they're not equal. So if you average together your breakdown scores, they don't come out at the same value as you've got for the overall scaled score. In fact, the way we do the scaling for each area is exactly the same. We use what the relative pass mark, and we scale around that. But in that case, it doesn't average together to reach that value. I know that's been something that we've had within the psychometric team, a couple of queries to clarify that process that we go through. But it's, I'd say, if all those proportions were equal, it would average together really nicely. But we stick to the proportions that are published in the assessment specification online.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, obvious when you think about it, but perhaps not so obvious at first blush. Thank you for that. We've had a question that asks, why are the pass rates so low? Well, the pass rate isn't predetermined. The standard has been set, and any candidate who meets or exceeds that standard will pass. If you look at other centrally set licensing exams for professions both here and across the world, we're not a particular outlier with the SQE. And I know comparisons are sometimes made with the LPC, and we are still publishing an annual report that includes data on completion rates for the LPC, and I think there's a view, perhaps because a different language was used for LPC, candidates didn't, I think, generally weren't described as failing. They were normally deferred or referred. I think maybe there's a misperception out there that there was very high pass rate stroke completion rate, which is the language for the LPC. But if you look at the data, that's not actually the case. Also on the LPC, Tim picked up the position of QRTS candidates and the transition arrangements for those, but some candidates are still, of course, able to make the choice between doing the LPC and the SQE, and we've had some questions about that choice. That's a choice for an individual to make. It's not for us to make. Clearly, the transition arrangements were put in place to enable legitimate expectations at the time of the introduction of the SQE to be fulfilled. I think, though, it's really important for candidates who have that choice, and of course not all candidates do, but if you have that choice, to think it through and to think through the consequences. So if you do the LPC, of course, what you then need to do is a period of recognised training, so known as in the past as a training contract. I've mentioned that in the previous session that we will be publishing a survey report, or a report on a survey we did about qualifying work experience, and in that we asked about the availability of periods of recognised training. So take that sort of information into account. Consider the likelihood of being able to get a period of recognised training, stroke training contract, at the end of your LPC, because that is what you will need to do to complete the LPC route. There is, of course, a transition facility available, so you could do LPC, and then if you can't get a period of recognised training, you could do SQE2 and then qualifying work experience. But that again is quite a big ask. Think about the cost, think about the time, and think about again, this was covered in the earlier session when Zoe was explaining and sharing some data on success rates in the SQE2 of candidates who haven't already passed SQE1. So the choice is for the candidate to make, but think carefully and look at the data available and take an informed choice. There's a question has come in as to whether we would ever contemplate not requiring FLK1 and FLK2 to be taken in the same sitting. I never say never. We do have an ongoing evaluation programme of the SQE, but we have no immediate plans to change that. Oh, and we've had some questions about the July SQE1 booking process. Yanis, I think probably that's one for you, if you can help.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. So just to give a bit more information about the timings, really. So next week there'll be more information on the website. So I'd encourage all candidates just to keep an eye on the homepage and the news item, just to give a bit more information about the process. And broadly, it's the same process we followed for the April SQE2 booking. So there'll be more general information available, and then once we've identified the candidates who are interested in sitting, we can then email them directly with the link, and that will be when the booking window opens in April. The date's already published. So more information will be available, so watch this space on the website, and then similarly we'll be publishing that information for the July SQE2 booking as well, which will come a little bit later. So main message is more information will be available on the website, and then as we've done before, we will email candidates directly with the seat reservation for them to complete, and with instructions on that and the timing set out as well for them to return that.
Thank you, Yanis. Go to the website, contact customer service team. There's lots of information available. The answer to your question is probably there, but if it isn't, don't hesitate to again contact him and his team. They'll be pleased to hear from you. Okay, we're about out of time, so can I thank our contributors very much indeed for sharing so much useful information. Thanks to Yanis, Lisa, Tim, Kate and Tim. Thank you to everybody who's joined this session this morning. Thank you for posting your questions. We'll check if we've had any come through that we haven't been able to pick up this morning, whether we can address them in future webinars or in forthcoming communications. Hope you found the session useful. A reminder that you can review it again at your leisure or recommend it to colleagues who you think might find it helpful. A reminder that the slides will be available to view as well. There will be an opportunity to feedback on this session. Please do so. If you're joining the afternoon session, you might choose to wait until then. A reminder that the afternoon session will start at 1:30. The focus of that session is on qualifying work experience, QWE. Hope a number of you will join that. I won't be chairing that session. My colleague Maxine Waugh, who's Head of Education and Training at the SRA, will be the chair. So it just remains for me to thank everybody for joining this morning and to wish you well. See you again soon at the next one. Thank you.